Hey Bibsy Squad, welcome back to another episode of Biblically Serious, where we're all about understanding the Bible and owning our faith. Today we are concluding our Biblical Theology series, and I want to focus on application. I want to show you how a Biblical Theology storyline transcends textual horizon, covenantal horizon, to show the whole story of the Bible. In the book, Biblical Theology in the Life of the Church, Michael Lawrence goes through 5 different biblical storylines that tell the whole story of the Bible from 5 different perspectives. But today I want to focus on his storyline of creation. First, we'll take a look at the story of creation within the Bible from Genesis to Revelations. We'll break down what patterns are in that storyline and how the story is told. And then we'll take a look at what the story tells us about God. In the story of the Bible, we see that God starts his story with creation and he ends it with creation. In Genesis 1, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So this is a cosmic overview of creation, with God creating day and night, the sea and land. But then when we move to Genesis 2, we see a little bit more details about creation, the relationship between man and woman in marriage, human responsibility, the dominion that God gives over the land and the animals. Everything is perfect and amazing until we hit Genesis 3. And in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve rebelled against God. Sin entered the world, causing it to be cursed and fallen. And things just kept getting worse and worse and worse until God was just like, you know what, this is enough. We need to start over. So as an act of judgment and mercy, God decides to wipe out humankind with a flood. But he also decides to preserve Noah's family and tells them to be fruitful and multiply in Genesis 9, which sounds very similar to what God commanded Adam and Eve in Genesis 2. But even though the world was externally cleansed, man was still evil and sin still prevailed. So it wasn't long until Adam's family was divided and cursed. Next, we move on to the story of Abram. And here we see a different type of new creation. Instead of God changing the external environment, God changes the man. Abram was a pagan idolater. God changed his heart and his name to Abraham. God promises Abraham that he would multiply his descendants as much as the stars in the sky. And this is in Genesis 12. So far we've already seen about 3 different types of creations, and we haven't even left Genesis yet. But let's go ahead and fast forward to the New Testament to Jesus. God incarnate comes to earth to offer dead sinners newness of life. He calls us into a new humanity, into a holy nation. And the work that Jesus started in the Gospels and the New Testament, we don't see that fulfilled until Revelations 21, where God brings a new heaven and a new earth. So now we know the story of creation. So let's look a little bit closer at how the story is being told. We'll dive a little bit deeper into the patterns that we can uncover as we look at the story from Genesis to Revelations. Just like any story, the story of creation has a narrative structure. It is narrative in the sense that it's telling a story, with the beginning of the story being creation, which we saw in Genesis. There's tension brought into the plot with the fall that happens in Genesis 3. And then after that, we see these cycles of recreation happening. And the cycle that we see includes creation, sin, judgment, and recreation. And it kind of goes on and on there. All these cycles of creation have their own mini little climaxes until we finally get to the main climax of the story in Revelations. Another pattern that we see in the story of creation is that God creates through his word and for his glory. In Exodus 19, under Moses' leadership, we see God audibly speak to the people, calling them his special people, his chosen nation, the recipients of that audible promise never actually got to see it fulfilled because they rebelled against God. He needed to judge them based off their rebellion, and he allowed them to die in the wilderness, and he rose up a new creation through their descendants, allowed them to enter the promised land, and also allowed a great King David to rise up and rule them as well. Did you also notice that the stories of creation is always centered around a singular human figure? We see Adam in Genesis, we see Noah, we see Moses, we see Jesus. There's this common theme that God uses an individual to create an agreement with so that he can connect to a larger group of people. Another thing that I tried to subtly highlight as I was telling the story of creation was to highlight the types of creation that exist. So we see in the beginning that God created the cosmos, the heavens, and the earth. And then we also see that he created mankind. And then we see that in Noah, he recreated the world by wiping out humanity, calling the nation of Israel out of slavery into a promised land. That was also another type of creation. All the different examples and types of creation that we see in the Bible, the goal is to point that towards the main type of new creation, the climactic new creation that we read about with Jesus is coming. Through these repetitive types of creation, we can learn a lot about who God is and how much he cares about us. So what does the story of creation tell us about God? 1, God creates from nothing. God needs no one, nothing to create anything and everything. He is not dependent on others. He is not dependent on science. He's not dependent on even our faith to create something out of nothing. God is a creative. I think we overlook a lot of times is like God created the earth. He created day and night. He created male and woman. He is a creative and he loves to create, and he does it in a way that he wants his glory reflected. That there's a part of him as a creator that wants to be reflected in the thing that he is creating. Another thing that we can see about God, he is Lord, he is powerful, and he will exercise his power when he determines that enough is enough and we need to start over, or we need to bring in a new creation. I said this earlier, God creates through his word and for his glory. We see that God speaks audibly in the beginning to create heaven and earth. We see God speak audibly to Moses on Mount Sinai to create a covenant with them and bring in a new creation there. But when the people that are bearing God's name don't live up to his glory or are not effectively displaying his glory, then there is a need for judgment, because God is a holy God and he wants to see his glory reflected in his creation. And it's not that God flips the switch and says, okay, you made a mistake and that's the end. We see multiple times that God is constantly reminding and warning his people that bear his name and his reputation to come back to him. But because of sin, creation isn't able to live up to its purpose of displaying God's glory. Creation has a purpose. And in order for us to fulfill that purpose, God knew that, there's no way we could do it on our own. So instead, we needed a savior to die in our place and to empower us to be holy. And the only person that could do that is God himself, because he is the definition of holiness. So the creator had to die for his creation so that we could be presented holy, beautiful, blameless, pure, just as he is. It feels like the creation story is really just a love story. God created us out of love. And the story of creation shows us to what extent God would go to make sure that we experience his love and display his glory. He loved us so much that he gave us chance after chance, warning after warning to come back to him. And once we got to our wit's end, he sent his son to die for us as a substitute so that we could know his love and that we would be empowered to display his glory.